This is a story about the supernatural.
Shelterwood is the land of dreams. If you want to find something here, you will.
This is a story of disappearances and homecomings.
I know your whole world has been turned upside down, but listen, I was really hoping I could convince you not to go back out there.
Investigating the disappearance of my sister, Sadie DeRosso.
I've never heard of anyone coming back, ever.
Subscribe now to Shelterwood, a Suburban Gothic, to follow this story.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week, we're passing the time by slinging greasy spoon specials and yapping with regulars and while we wait here from developer Bad Vices Games. Playing as Cliff or Nora, a couple working their last shift at their backroads diner before moving on to the next chapter of their lives. But as evening and orders roll on, the casual conversation with regulars and clienteles begins to shift into the unexplainable, making this one final shift they'll never forget. So I decided to pick this game this week for the very simple reason that I was browsing Steam as I usually am, and I had seen that friend of the show, Herc, aka Horror Visuals on Twitter and Blue Sky. You know, he has a Steam curated list of mostly indie horror games that he recommends. And this was one of them. And, you know, I think we can both say that, like, when we see something that catches Herc's eye, more than likely it's worth checking out. And so, you know, getting to dive into this game with no real expectations outside of, you know, okay, this is more or less like a game you can complete in 2 or 3 sittings. It has that sort of PSX style look to it. It's first person. I know it's horror. We've played enough of these types of games that we more or less know what to expect. And, you know, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that this game really does kind of circumvent some of those expectations, I think, pretty shocking way from what I found. Like, you know, I even remarked to you a few weeks ago, actually, when I was just kind of mentioning, oh yeah, I'm playing this. I think we should cover it. And I had mentioned, like, oh, this game takes a pretty big pivot early on within those first like 10 minutes, right? Because the game opens and, you know, you're the couple and either the wife or the husband, and then, you know, you're talking with some customers, you're going to take some orders, but then, you know, you go into the back room to go get ingredients and you come back and all of a sudden the diner is filled with people in like hazmat suits, and they're just like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, just one of these instances where you're just completely taken aback by what's happening. And the game really does like shift from what that expectation was early on. So yeah, I'm curious, like, what were sort of your expectations going into while we wait here, and sort of, was this game able in the long run to kind of circumvent those in a meaningful way for you?
Yeah, it kind of like turned in on itself in terms of my expectation, because I saw the title and description first and like the main image, and I had a very particular idea of it being a very narrative driven game, and it being very, given recent weeks and months, a very visual novel-esque, maybe point and click-esque. But then sort of seeing it, you know, in action and going, oh, hang on, this is, you know, the PS1, PS2 style It's probably more PS2 to be fair, actually, if you're looking at this. And so, okay, so maybe it's not that kind of game at all, but because I guess it's because the combination of things I don't really put together. When we talk about like retro style games in this sort of vein, they usually pixel art generally, or something like that, and so I didn't really expect that sort of polygonal sort of effect like that low res ideal. And then playing the game itself, find the answer to that will always it's all of those things to some degree. It has a bit of everything, and it takes a bit of each part to sort of create this new little thing. It's not a survival horror game, but it kind of evokes that atmosphere at times because of the look of it, like that. And I can think of certain like early narrative games from that era as well that like no disrespect to this game, but like David Cage's Fahrenheit, it's like it kind of reminds me of that. Not like what's in it or anything, just in terms of like I think there's a whole diner thing in that game as well too. But it's a game I didn't know where it was going several times over, and as you said in that opening, where it's like because I didn't look at the Steam page or anything like that after that. I did for descriptions and stuff. I just looked at the blurb, looked at the images. That was it. And so I didn't see like very tongue in cheek, but like it's a kitchen management game with dialogue choices. like oh shit, yeah, it is. I mean, it is in a very simple sense. Like as we'll get into, that's probably a very deliberate choice. But yeah, I wherever it went for a while, it was very hard to sort of discern what I was getting here, and it was quite interesting. I suppose my end reaction from that ended up being like, it's a book game, like it's a game that's played out in the structure of like a story in a book, and like especially in terms of like the different narrative perspectives and like just the imagery and like even the simple way the characters are done, where it's like they are like broad strokes as characters go, but I think they fit the theme of what the game's going for really well.
Yeah, I think that for me, I was expecting something that was going to be a lot more straightforward, perhaps, just because of kind of the general premise of it all. It has this apocalyptic backdrop to it that the players find out about relatively early. Clearly, the Steam page and, assets there within will be a heavy indication of that. So going into it, I assumed it was going to be a lot more straightforward. And what we got, I think, was much more of a narrative focus on individuality and, the process of the next chapter in your life, not just the protagonists, but, by an effect, all of the customers that come in and getting to know them more. And you get to see into more of these different people's lives that going into the game, you have no expectation for, or, would even think, oh, this could be the focus of it. It really is one of those games that I think does a really good job of utilizing the backdrop of horror to have more grounded conversations about sort of like life, right? And, going through various changes, not all of them are positive or very graceful in their implementation in terms of those changes. But I think that like ultimately it is a game that's able to kind of like not only keep you guessing with what it's going to do next, but I don't know, for me, like it makes you feel connected to characters in a way that on the surface is not really indicative of sort of like getting to know them, so to speak, and their backstories, which you will experience firsthand, through that kitchen management aspect of it, which was hilarious because I didn't know that had anything to do with the game. The protagonists being, owners of a diner, what does the player do a lot of the time? They're literally taking character orders and then going into the back to get ingredients and then whipping up, eggs and burgers and getting beer and whiskeys for people, which I don't know if you noticed, but like this place has the heaviest pour imaginable for drinks for some of these patrons. But I think overall, like it does a good enough job of blending the aspects of like actually having something tactile to do, but also like knowing when to take the player outside of the kitchen management aspect of it to explore the sort of inner workings of their patrons, if you will.
Yeah, and it's a little clunky at first to sort of get used to that, and because as I said, you don't really have a handle on what kind of game it's going to be. But yeah, I think it kind of smooths itself out, and you get the rhythm of it as it goes on. I mean, it being relatively short means that rhythm doesn't get too long to go, but it's important to understand it in that context. And yeah, we've actually talked about so many games in the past, in horror especially, in modern terms, where the mundane jobs are like part of the furniture. They are part of like making the horror come out, and that was very early on a thing. I was thinking, is it going to be one of those sort of things? Yeah, but again, using that as a sort of very melancholy sort of backdrop for everything that does go on, where it's like doomy in a very sort of hazy, dreamy last days of life in different perspectives and variances of that, and yeah, it's a sort of atmosphere I didn't really expect to get from it because of that. But yeah, again, using things that I had expected, like once you see that sort of mundane job simulator thing with a horror twist, you do think of certain games, and it isn't that kind of game, which is great.
Yeah, and there is sort of like creating this notion of familiarity with the patrons, right? I mean, as the player, you're meeting them for the first time, but you're on a first name basis with some of the customers that come in, and how the conversation sort of unravels. And for me, like there was something sort of immersive, even if maybe by the end of the game, I was kind of like, okay, I'm kind of tired of making the same 4 things. And sometimes being limited to only 4 objects to your inventory can complicate trying to manage multiple orders or this or that. But like ultimately there was something intimate about making and preparing food for people that your character knows, and then you have the conversation playing out in the background while you're doing these, again, like these sort of mundane tasks, if you will. I wanted to ask, like for you, which was the character that you ended up playing as a majority of the time? Because that changes based on some of the discussions that you have and the choices you make in those discussions.
Yeah, so originally it was Cliff I ended up getting, like for my run. So yeah, which is I have seen that obviously there are differences as well with this, depending on which one you end up saddled with, and but most of it with those two tends to go down the same sort of route. It's like, but yeah, it's still like what personality they get as well kind of is important, like in terms of like their decision making and how you take that on, especially in like interacting with the customers. And there is actually I think one of the earliest examples of that is that before you even get the choice is that sort of dealing with the angry drunk, and like how his attitude is very different to Nora than it is to Cliff, sort of thing. And like despite them doing the exact same job, the exact same way, sort of thing. And yeah, I think that does bleed through as well, depending on who you are, like in terms of who will tell you what and how, sort of thing. Which I felt was like a really sort of smart way of choosing it. How about you? Who did you end up with?
Yeah, I ended up with Nora a majority of the time. And it is one of those things, like you noted, I think that is an aspect of this game that I appreciated, was that, oh, hey, these decisions actually do have some semblance of a difference overall. It's not kind of this like, I don't know, this set dressing of like, oh, well, if you replay it, you get the other side of the story, and then you spend that time doing it, and it's basically like a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually matter. But here, because it's decision based, you feel like you actually get to step into the shoes of another character that helps to lend insight into some of the revelations that come up based on these characters, the ways that you're getting to see their inner workings in these little styled vignettes, which we'll get into. But I thought it was a worthwhile addition. And again, like I felt that perhaps the dialogue options that were given actually felt in line with my understanding of both Nora and Cliff. And so, furthermore, as we know with how this story plays out, like that has some pretty important implications down the road for like how this narrative plays out once you get the full picture of what is actually going on and whatnot, and sort of just your understanding of that narrative and individuals and how, you know, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you initially realize. I think that the aspect of this game that I did really appreciate was initially I thought this was just going to be, again, this like slice of single location horror, which I'm a huge fan of, right? But the environment itself does not really lend to that in the way that we're used to, I think, with a lot of times when you have those single location horror games, you know, the environment changes drastically over time or you unlock new aspects of it. Whereas the diner itself, outside of one late stage moment later on, is relatively unchanged. But the way in which, you know, Bad Vice's games goes about not letting you get tired of this environment is the fact that you quite literally leave it at times. With each new character that's introduced, you get to basically experience a series of vignettes that are key moments in their life or a look into their life that kind of like shows the player ultimately like the greater thematic connection between the storytelling here, but also like what makes those characters tick, what brought them to the diner, in a way that I thought was really effective.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, when I said at the beginning about them being quite broad strokes characters, that is just generally to begin with, to give you like a preconception of who these people are. Because they're all, you know, on the surface stereotypical sort of characters you would expect in a way. But when you do get these little pockets of their lives, like, and get to experience them in the way that a video game does so well, you know, like because you get to physically be that character, you know, for a bit, you get a bit more weight out of it, you know, even when it's something that's quite, like I said, very broad strokes. And like, yeah, it's takes on little things here. There's some nice surprises, some quite sad, melancholy things that go on, and you know, given again the game and what it does, it makes perfect sense that each character kind of relives very particular memories. I mean, they're not all like flashbacky either. Some are just like kind of side saddle, like you know, you have Lisa and Alex, you know, which a story that comes up out of nowhere near the beginning of the game, where you're like, okay, why am I here now? Like that, because it comes after like the big reveal, basically, of this game, and yeah, it feels disconnected. But you know, and compared to like pretty much everyone else who turns up, it's like, yeah, it's the only ones that sort of get introduced outside of that diner, you know, in that way. So yeah, I did like that. There's where the repetition could have been, I think, as well with these stories, if they were all kind of introduced in the same way. Oh, we're all in the diner, we're all telling our story, blah blah blah. So to have like their story be done that way, and then having some characters that really don't get much, they're kind of just there for plot reasons, like with the couple William and Rachel. Like William has a story, Rachel doesn't really, apart from that she is a mother, and that's it. But yeah, again, it's context that is important for why William's story is important, you know, and his connection to this diner as well. So, like I said, when the pieces start coming together, and it really does sort of make it quite satisfying. It's not one of those where like every single character thing is intertwined. It's like no, there are bits that do, but there's also just bits that just happenstance and stuff that's just individual stories, you know. I think the only sort of ambiguity to it is probably in how it just wraps up and ends in terms of like how real you want it to be, I suppose. But yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. And like I said, it could have been so easy just to do a very repetitive sort of tell each person's story one after the other in the diner thing, but it's handled in close to that sort of Edith Finch sort of way of like you're sort of stumbling into the next story, you know, just out of nowhere. And yeah, it's segmented a bit more because each area is obviously loaded in and like, again, giving it very sort of retro sort of feel as well in terms of that. But say that's another reason why it feels quite book-like for me, because that feels like very distinct, like turning of the page, new chapter sort of thing.
Absolutely. I think for me, the thing that I initially struggled with was like trying to piece together what all of this has to do with one another, right? Like, what is the greater significance here? But I think that, like you'd said, by the time you get to the conclusion of this and those pieces start to fall into place, it made me really want to go back and like think about each of these characters in a new light. And what I more so appreciated, and, you comparing this to like having a book quality to it, both in structure and I think also just in like getting to know these characters and finding the thematic connection between them. There's the aspect that like there's great care, I think, that's been given to these characters, and that, some of them, you meet them initially and you think you have them kind of like pegged as like, oh, well, this is all they are, is this kind of like exterior. This basically, some of them, in one instance, like Eddie's a UFO fanatic who's this kind of like, he's basically a caricature, right? He's got literally has the tinfoil hat on and everything like that, and shows up and he's like raving mad and whatnot. But once you get into these sections of his, and, while they are the more fantastical and like action oriented, which we can talk about maybe after our break, like he is a character though that I think you can actually have some semblance of sympathy for once you get to know more about him, and you get to see this character as somebody that, is not a caricature, but, somebody that's suffering, and the way that they are is the result of suffering of various degrees and whatnot. And I think that kind of stems not only from us making assumptions about characters, but through our investigation of like learning who they are, but also like the conclusion of this game, which we're not going to get into those exacts, but like you get these little wrap ups of certain characters. And I'll say that that's an extension of feeling like once you come to the initial ending, because as with any game that's choice based and multiple endings, there's going to be, the good ending, the bad ending, that type of thing. And I found that the good ending for these characters was not only fitting, but it felt like I myself could have guessed that this was going to be their ending because of the journey that they've gone on, the journey we've gone on with them, and more or less like either them accepting something or finding a solution to that, which, has basically like haunted them to varying degrees in their lives, whether it's a short term or, an immediate haunting, like you mentioned with those previous characters. So I think that, again, like there is something to having such a diverse cast of characters from backgrounds and the various maybe caricature nature of some of them. But I think ultimately like them being characters that are all dealing with, for the most part, like real grounded issues that couples or individuals have, is what humanizes them against this very fantastical backdrop that, is it happening? Is it not type of a thing? Like it just, it makes for a game where its story, I think, has a bit more bite than I was anticipating for something that I kind of figured was going to be this mostly investigating the supernatural, which this game really is not concerned with.
Yeah, that's it. The other thing that sort of came to mind, because we talked about it before, and like a lot of things we talked about in that, not on this podcast, but on one we did together, Genre Haze, was Miracle Mile, and having a very sort of like people just congregating at the end of something, and like just kind of reflecting on their life in that regards, because that's how this is presented. It's presented as some sort of apocalyptic event is happening, and like, but everything's a bit swimmy, and it's seeing the reactions of people in those moments, and it not all being like shock, horror, terror, and kind of just like a numbness to it, and where that people kind of blot that out and then kind of start looking inward and thinking about their lives in that regard. So it was. I clearly am a sucker for that kind of a thing anyway, it seems. But the sort of existential, doomy, gloomy stuff handled in a way that, again, we don't don't want to spoil it, which is the problem with this one. But I think the way there is ambiguity towards the end of this game does leave it nicely open for interpretation a bit. You know, like there is a very simple, solid way of looking at it. Like, okay, this happened to this person, this happened to this person, blah 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 blah, like that. But yeah, there's other ways to look at it too, which are a bit more spiritual, supernatural, you know, like that, and that's great too. You know, like I like that we have these different options, and I think that's really what elevates the game at that point, where it's like, yeah, you do have these sort of extra warmth and depth to the characters based on what you've learned from them and how you've advised them effectively, which is where most of the choices come through. Is that, you know, you hear their stories, you basically kind of advise them what they should do, like that, which they tend to sort of go, yeah, once you've convinced them enough, and like or on it, and yeah, like that, and seeing the consequences of that play out is quite, yeah, like you said, there's some of it is just kind of sad, you know, and kind of heartbreaking, but also some of it's a bit, yeah, as expected, and yeah, it's a really cool sort of mixture of things.
Yeah, I think for me, and it's something where, like, as soon as I finished the game, I wanted to read online, see what some people thought about it, how some people felt, but I feel like as soon as I finished this, I kind of more or less knew that this was going to be one of those games that has sort of like a 50-50 split almost of people that, like, not to sound too pretentious, like, get it, right? Understand what we're doing, what this developers were doing here with this storytelling, how you can utilize genre to, either elevate or emphasize certain aspects of the human condition, and, or just telling a narrative that, quite literally forces people in unconventional ways to confront what in some instances are very conventional struggles and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, some people are going to be looking for a lack of that ambiguity, which you get here. They want more concrete answers, and that's not really the point of the experience, right? It's funny. I was going through and actually reading some reviews for this game, and people were like taking it to task in a critical sense for the type of narrative that's here, and saying it's open-ended and doesn't have a fitting conclusion, but, without stating the explicit aspects of the finale here. Like, I thought that this game did a great job of being well-rounded in presenting the subject matter that it does, and the various vignettes of the individuals, and having them be, playing against the backdrop of this perceived end of the world. But it's really just an excuse for people to face these types of issues. And, as we've talked about previously, plenty of times, more so specifically in film perhaps, but like, horror is this fantastic vessel for telling unconventional sort of truths, or just facing unconventional different struggles that characters are having, and utilizing the medium of horror to do so. And it doesn't always have to be this like black or white thing of like, well, how did the apocalypse start? What is causing it? Are they going to survive? Like those kinds of things. That's just not the type of story this is. But yeah, we can unpack that and a little bit more. I wanted to chat about some of those vignette encounters that you have when you're put into the shoes of other characters. But we can chat about that when we come back from our break in a moment.
You love video games, but you don't always have time for video games. Post Games is a new podcast for the indoor kids who had to grow up. Each week, veteran game journalist Chris Plant, that's me, combines original interviews and reporting to answer your most pressing video game questions. Who is creating all of those new, sexy, not safe for work games? How did video game movies go from box office poison to blockbuster? Find out on Post Games, available now on your favorite podcast app.
This episode is brought to you by Battlefield 6. Battlefield 6 is the ultimate all-out warfare experience. Rip through the skies in aerial dogfights. Demolish your surroundings for a strategic advantage. Harness complete control over every action and movement using the kinesthetic combat system. Drop into multiplayer with your squad, or fight furiously as a member of the Dagger 1-3 squad in a gritty, adrenaline-fueled single-player campaign where you'll defend a world on the edge of collapse.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. it transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
And we're back from our break. And as we chatted about briefly, those vignette sections actually allow you to leave the diner, and then they put you into the shoes of one of those other characters, and you get to see firsthand some of the things that they're facing. And, you know, at times you might say like, oh, maybe this is not the most reliable of narrators, but I think that ultimately is one of the strengths, because you quite literally get to see through the eyes of these characters as they perceive their life. You know, I had mentioned that character Eddie, right? The UFO fanatic. He has the most fantastical vignette sections of this, right? You see him being this person that lives on the outskirts. His mother is calling and trying to get him to take his medication, which he stopped taking. And you get this sense of like, oh, okay, this is someone that is unwell and is basically falling down this rabbit hole of their delusions. And then, you know, you get this first person shooter mini game of his where he's like shooting bottles and whatnot. But then, you know, that evolves into the delusion of he's shooting aliens and then government agents, to the degree that inevitably he ends up on like a spaceship. And it's like in these games of like trying to survive wave after wave of aliens, fighting them off with like a Mossberg rifle. But it is one of those things where like, even as ridiculous as that seems, those moments did sort of like build this sense of sympathy that I had for this character, and that like, oh, this is clearly an unwell person. Right. This is somebody that is falling for their delusions. Clearly, you know, their relationship with their family is not as strong as it could be, or is not, you know, the healthiest of relationships. And I thought that that was a smart direction to take this character's vignettes, because of the fact that it makes you view him as more than just like a caricature of an insane person. And I think ultimately like his little finale and his sort of like wrap up on his narrative after the credits rolled further just kind of like helps to sell him as, no, this is a person that's unwell, and whether they get the help they need or not, you kind of like want them to find that, whatever that answer may be.
Yeah, and it could have been unconvincing because he's, as you said, very stereotypical, down to a voice that just sounds very typically like weedy, nerdy. I know, you know, stones and glass houses and all that, but still, it's he makes it believable, because after you get that sort of fantastical sort of alien shooting thing, it's, you know, going back to the diner and just like the pleading way he sort of says, "Why does no one believe me?" sort of thing like that. You can feel the truth in what he's saying, like, you know, how readily he believes what he's saying, like that. And it's just, yeah, they're in straight away. It's like a heartbreaker, you know, to have someone just clearly not understand their problem and like, and why, you know. And it's, yeah, one of the most effective moments, I think, in terms of like humanizing someone beyond their sort of baseline sort of characteristics in this game. And yeah, Eddie's stuff was the standout anyway, just because games and shooting go, where they go together like that. And but yeah, it was just, I think, just to sort of go on from that, I think because each sort of section is very different, like in terms of size, structure, style, like it is, no one is the same as the other, and they kind of suit the personalities of the people you're going. Like Hank's, the old timer farm owner guy, like that. His is basically just about like the psychological abuse. All you do basically is like get hay and move hay to one place to the other, but with the constant sort of really being berated for who you are and what you're doing, like, and it's like, again, it's just the wistful regret he has even in adult life, about that. And the Lisa and Alex thing is, like I said, because it's kind of like the widest story, of those few, because it's told in different parts. Where you get that sort of them just coming out of the club and very quickly establishing like their relationship is one of like big sister, little sister almost, and trying to look out for each other. And it Alex having a bit of an anger problem in terms of like confronting guys that she doesn't like. Where she smashes that, Lisa's boyfriend's car, with which you get to do as much as you like. In that section, you can beat every single panel and window on that car at that point. But then where that takes that story when you come back to them, after they've turned up at the diner, and then you get the rest of their story like that. It's a really good sort of strong end to that one. Not everyone gets like the same sort of luck, I suppose, in terms of that. I mean, Mandy doesn't get much. She's a plot device, effectively, like that. I mean, a good one in terms of like they set up, like, oh, you've come back. She's a hometown girl who's been in a movie and now she's back again. But why is she back? And then alludes to the fact that she's back because she's met someone and like who she was working with in the movie, and so she is kind of like ends up being the background of someone else's story, effectively. But which I don't know, it's probably my weakest of the stories, like in terms of like the couple. We are spoiling all this with it, I know, but we're not spoiling the ending. But yeah, the whole thing of like William happening to turn up here at one place where the woman he's having an affair with, it happens to be on the stay. But so that whole thing with that couple, I didn't really care for much. Like I just because of how nothing like Rachel and the child was to that, again, just background noise to that story, just like that's the guilt that's hanging on you, sort of thing. But the visualization of that in William's segment where he's like doing the baby's room like that, I also don't think it helps that like in all the like the stereotypical stuff that is on the surface of these characters, if you don't then have a character to have the chance to go beyond that, like Rachel, it just comes across as being stereotypical, and she is very much the oh my god, gee golly whiz, sort of I'm the perfect wife type, like that thing, and which is good in this one case because I think it helps to sort of sell just how bad a mistake he's made and how much guilt you should feel. And you get to do that little like spray painting the walls of the baby's room like that, and then it comes up with all like the graffiti of like guilt and accusations of what he's done, and it's like, so yeah, while it's not my favorite as a whole structured piece, I do think it's probably one of the more interesting ones in terms of like how they get to. It's like it's an interesting one for me. I think it's just because of the fact that so many characters kind of take a back seat in that story, apart from William, like that, and you don't get to see more of it. Even like the ending I got for that was like nothing. Yeah, it was like, yeah, it was expected. Yeah, like we were saying earlier, like you could kind of see where these stories were going to go. But yeah, that one was like, yeah, no, it's like not really doing much for me. But hey, that's what it is. I don't know how you felt about the other stories.
Yeah, for me, I think that probably the strongest one was outside of Eddie. I would say that it's more or less like in the descending order of characters you meet. Like Hank, I thought was great because of the fact that you get one of those clear-cut examples of like, okay, here is how this trauma has informed this person's life, and this instilling of like hard work is all that there is to life, and you need to be working all the time, this and that, and like, and then at the same time, it's an example of how you're able to utilize the genre to have a moment that is like overtly horrifying and monstrous and have it directly relate to how this character views what is, a much more grounded issue. It's like, how does he see his father as this father that is this monster, basically? Well, he sees a literal depiction of him as a monster, and like getting to have that little genre moment was a nice sort of like, I suppose, reprieve from what a majority of the game is, which is not those moments. And so you get these little sprinkling of genre moments to just like further emphasize what is so central to these characters, what's that informed by, while also seeing, other than just like, oh, cool, I get to see a monster. You get to see how this person that is traumatized by that other character views them, right? To a certain extent. It's like, it doesn't matter if they look like a monster or not. They are a monster to them. And so I think being able to sort of like make that even more apparent to the player is one of those aspects of Hank's story that I like. I also absolutely love the brief glimpse that you get for his ending, for I believe it's the good ending. Like it's just so short, so brief, but it's so perfect because it's informed by what we know about that character, what we know that character needs, and to get to see semblance of that sort of like relief that they need from that baggage. I was a big fan of, and I think that, you're right. Mandy is more or less just this sort of like plot device. And while the couple at the end is probably the weakest of all of them, it does though speak to like the kind of full circle nature of this game of what I appreciate. And, having all of these stories be interconnected in a way that you obviously can't see coming. And at the same time, it shows like, you actually have some sort of influence on what's happening based on the advice you give. With that couple, you have that instance where it's pretty brief and pretty quick, but you can't miss it. It's like, oh, they're walking down the street and he stops and gazes at a poster on a wall. And you're like, oh, I had a direct impact on what that signifies. And so, it's not my favorite narrative beats, but I found that ultimately like, oh, okay, it's all full circle in a way that is very fitting for this type of game and experience. And, if it had been slightly longer, maybe they could have fleshed those stories out more. I don't think that would have necessarily been a bad thing. I wish maybe spent less time behind the grill and more time in the lives of others, which is arguably the strongest aspect of this game. So that's one of those things that I suppose I was a little on the fence about, but I think that it does come, again, just like very full circle in a way that I can appreciate and didn't see coming, especially with that major reveal towards the end, which was quite out of left field, but at the same time, again, like very, very fitting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a jazziness to how everything sort of comes together because, like I said, no one piece fits the other in the same way, and that's what makes it interesting. As much as we can say, with the Mandy William thing is, as much as like the Lisa and Alex thing, it's a story that comes together in different parts at different times and different ways, and really like that's a strength again. And even with the cooking itself, which is there, but it's there's not really any rush with it. You don't really have to do much to get it right. And as the game itself, it's not a game of game overs. It's not a game of failure. It's a game of just do stuff like that and be in the moment. And I think in that sense, you can sort of dictate the pace, but some of that's hard to do until you kind of get a grip on it. I think it's the sort of thing where you need to play it again to sort of get the mood, but you won't get some of the wonder. So it's one of those tricky things where you can see what they were going for as an overall package, but it almost kind of needs you to know stuff ahead of time to sort of make it work entirely. But it's probably why they do sort of put it very upfront about like the kitchen management simulator thing in there. It's an interesting hook, isn't it? If you at least you're gonna like tell a narrative based thing, you might as well have something in it that's a bit different. But then I could easily see an accusation of it being quite loose in terms of story structure as a result too, in the way it is. But it comes back to that idea of broad strokes and like what you take from the end of all of it, I suppose. And like I said, because of that ambiguity that is there, you may not take as much as someone else would. I mean, outside like story things, like the only thing that ended up irking me was one of the cooking sections slightly glitched for me. So Cliff was like basically turned sideways, so I couldn't see properly. I couldn't bring up the recipes, and fudged through it. It was fine, but it's like it kind of ruined that section because you're not concentrating so much on like what's going on in the story, more like how the fuck do I do all this when I'm not really looking at properly like that. Like it was just some weird thing of coming out of the freezer and then coming back into the diner where it didn't unstick a turn basically.
I did have an instance where I I couldn't like put something back down. I picked up like a plate with silverware and then had basically, I needed one less item in my inventory, which would have been that, but I couldn't put it back. So then I just had to I just reloaded. It was not a big deal, but yeah, it was like in something that is so tightly sort of just like constructed with being on the tracks, to have a moment like that at times can just kind of like derail you a little bit. But fortunately, I only had 1 or 2 instances like that during my course.
Yeah, which again, not a big deal. It's just that when you're trying to make it sort of fit together, it's nice to have a smooth run with these things.
Yeah, I suppose like the last thing I would say probably about what makes each of these characters work so well in addition to the writing is just, naturally the voice acting. I thought the voice acting was like pretty good. You could tell like this is mostly a group of people that not extensively work in video games, and like looking at their IMDb's, I think that's the case for the most part. But at the same time, like there's some that have more experience in that than others. And I think that was important because of the fact that it gives, again, like a good variety of voices, not only in terms of, actual, like the ways in which people speak, but more importantly, like people that maybe come from different schools of voice acting. Some people have done anime, some people that have actually been in film, some that have been more in games, but it kind of like fuels that setting for this game of like, oh, this is a diner that's comprised of some people are local, some people are out of town. Like you get a good feel for a diner, which is that, it's a hotbed of people from different backgrounds and different places, and some familiarity, some not, some friendly, some less than so. And so I think that again was like one of those aspects that kind of like helped to facilitate the feel of the diner itself, which then ultimately just lends itself to being like this haven of various forms of like communicating with people and getting to know people. So for that, I guess I was thankful that it helped kind of like build that atmosphere a little bit more.
Yeah, so just sort of end on it, like obviously we talked about the other people's stories, but obviously Cliff and Nora are like being like the protagonists effectively of this thing with the alternate stories. I mean, they've got little bits peppered in here as well, which and obviously it becomes clear very early on that something bad has happened in this relationship, in terms of what's going on in the diner. But yeah, that was probably the story that obviously had the longest legs, I think, for me, where it just because it starts with an interesting hook and then it keeps sort of being unreliable in terms of like, well, what is it? What's going on with them? Why is it? Did this happen? Did that happen then? When did this happen? Sort of thing. But yeah, you get little glimpses of their relationship, over time. Like the fact that Cliff was like just used to be a customer who was hired by Nora's father when he owned the diner, and you get that little flashback of Cliff coming to the diner just specifically out of his way to go and meet Nora. It's sweet, it's nice, and I think adds just what their story needs, for in terms of like that. And the only other character of note of the 10 people, I suppose, in this is obviously the angry drunk, who's the catalyst for this big thing. It's like, and again, he's much like Mandy, he's there to play a role and be part of their story with that one. And yeah, like that's fine. But yeah, I think as a sort of wraparound that they are, Cliff and Nora, it's a sweet story and probably is the most telling one in terms of like what you do. This story is telling us in general, like the whole theme of it. So yeah, I mean, for me, that's how I felt about them. I don't know how you sort of felt about their sort of part of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think just on the surface, you have this couple that is like on the cusp of making a massive change in their lives, knowing what they, what they one of them want for the future, if there's like a moment of uncertainty in that, and then to have this massive event occur just as they're on the cusp of something new is an easy hook to become engaged in, and the sort of like emotional investment there. But like you'd said, you get to see glimpses of their past and whatnot, and you get to see moments in their present where you kind of get to more and more insight into their relationship, into the individuals themselves. And I don't know, it makes for a couple that in a game full of various stories that interweave between those various narratives, like you're never really allowed to forget the importance of these characters and how decisions affect them. And ultimately like getting to see snapshots in their life that's not always clear, but then by the end of it, you kind of get the sense you had this full journey and understanding ultimately like how they arrived here and, you know, the unfortunate nature of having to face realities that you might not want to.
Yeah. I mean, there was, it wasn't one of those, oh, like, oh, well, financially we have to leave sort of thing stories. It was them trying to do it on their own terms as well, which I think adds a nice bit of tragic beauty to the story as well. You know, they tried to do something on their terms, and you know, the universe said different sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a cool sort of wrinkle on that story.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you compare their narrative to others that are in this story, you're kind of like, well, okay, why do we keep leaving this one that should be at the forefront of the experience, right? And you're never allowed to completely forget that, but I think that ultimately it is important to have all these other characters and the vignettes of experiencing their lives because of the fact that it reinforces this notion of like, you might have the perfect plan and been, you know, working up towards something or find yourself at this point where you're ready to make a leap, but the universe can, you know, throw a wrench in those works to varying degrees. And it kind of just adds that bittersweet, tragic notion of just like making time for things in the moment rather than this notion of getting trapped in a loop of like one day. Like that's one of the things I kind of took away from this was just like that notion of one day that could send you down a path by the time you get to the end of it, you're like, oh, I should have done this 20 years ago or something like that. And that I think ultimately is a more haunting ending, even if it's not, you know, the most original of realizations. It's a more haunting of an ending than anything that has to do with the apocalypse.
Oh,
my
yeah,
opinion.
I mean, yeah, exactly. Because as you say, it's like, it's one of those things that isn't surprising or, you know, fresh in that sense, but the whole point of that problem is what we've said is that you keep experiencing it because you keep going, well, one day, and one day just doesn't come, or you know, decades pass, and that's quite in itself. You can't escape it, even if you may realize it. Yeah, and therein, as you said, lies the horror.
I think that for a game such as this, that, you know, is quite small, you could finish it. I think I finished this in 2 sittings, maybe. It's like $5. I think that while you could have some faults with like maybe the restaurant sim management stuff or whatever, like I found that what it sets out to do and how it kind of like circumvented my expectations for it ended up being a bit more profound of a game with something to say than what I was expecting. So I was really appreciative of that ultimately. And I think that, you know, while we've always been a fan of these smaller games, I just think it speaks to like utilizing games to tell narratives that, you know, it might not be at home in like a visual novel, so to speak. You can have these sort of like 3D interactive games, but still have the same sort of construction almost, right? It's like what you're doing is not always the most important thing in the world, but you can still have some tactile nature to an experience like this with a narrative that's playing out. So I think, yeah, in that regard, I was glad we could make some time for this one this month because kind of jumped out at me and didn't disappoint in that regard.
Yeah, and it kind of felt like a good game for this time of year in terms of atmosphere and vibes. Yeah, it's always a handy bonus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we're recording this today in Massachusetts, it is a dreary storm of a day that's very apocalyptic looking. So it's equally fitting as we're having the beginning of a nor'easter here. So yeah, it's perfectly fitting in more ways than one.
Definitely.
But as always, my friend, it is a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.
How can I describe this catastrophe? I had worked hard for nearly 2 years, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created.
Regarding Frankenstein is crowdfunding now. Go to bit.ly/REFrankenstein to support the show.